Good morning. Let's see if we can come to order here. That would mean stop talking, find a seat, sign in afterwards. I am far less trusting than are some of my colleagues, apparently. And let's focus here for a few minutes. So in 2004, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia was able to add an amendment to a spending bill, and what that amendment did was to declare September 17th as Constitution and Citizenship Day. That date was chosen because it's the date on which the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention signed the Constitution in 1787. The act also says that educational institutions are to offer programming on the history of the Constitution on Constitution Day. And at one level, we do that through Political Science 352, but in recent years, we've felt like we need to do more than that, and so we've used one of the GVAL lectures in the fall at a time at least close to Constitution Day to bring in a speaker to talk about the history of the Constitution. Our GVAL's lectures, the Geneva Visiting Artist in the Lecture Series, are funded by the generosity of Iva Patterson and Dale Gilmore through the Visiting Artist in the Lecture Series, and through Paul Gilmore from the class of 31 in the Staley Distinguished Scholars Series. And we use that money to bring in, over the course of the year, various speakers on topics, but again, in September, we always have one speaking about the history of the Constitution and related topics. And today, our speaker is Dr. Robert George. Robert George is a professor, he's the 6th McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. He is the director of Princeton's James Madison program that he helped fund in start in 2000. He is a visiting scholar and lecturer at various universities and think tanks. If I read all of this, he won't have time for his lecture, so I'm going to add it a little bit. He has chaired the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's served on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. And yes, I expect my students to know all of this. So there. He has been a U.S. member of the UNESCO's World Commission on Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. He's been a judicial fellow at the U.S. Supreme Court. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Swarthmore College. He holds a JD and MTS degrees from Harvard University, as well as a Doctor of Philosophy and various other degrees from Oxford University. And he holds 23 honorary degrees, so people must like him. He is a recipient of numerous awards. I don't have time to read them all, but you can find his biography and see them, all of which testify to his work in religious freedom, in understanding Constitution and legal theory, and in American values, and particularly how religious and natural law values relate to our understanding of society, constitutionalism, etc. Professor George is the author of Making Men Moral, Civic Liberties and Public Morality, and In Defense of Natural Law, among many other works. And he's given lectures at various institutions, including doing the Constitution Day lecture for the Library of Congress. In his spare time, he is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, he's of counsel of the law firm, and he's a bluegrass banjo player and fingerstyle guitarist. So I was hoping we were going to get musical accompaniment to the lecture today, but apparently not. But we will manage to persevere. So in short, Dr. George is eminently qualified to speak to us on the history of the Constitution, and for our Constitution Day lecture, he's speaking on constitutional structures and civic virtues. So please give him your attention. Let's welcome him.
Well, thank you, Professor, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you, Madam Provost, for the wonderful hospitality that I've enjoyed from you and the faculty during my visit here. It's a great honor for me to visit Geneva College. This is a very distinguished institution with a wonderful history. It's my first visit to your campus, and I couldn't be more pleased. I hope before I have to run out the door that I'll get to meet some of you students. Our Constitutional Convention on September 17th of 1787 had its members sign the proposed Constitution that would go out for ratification by the states. It was ratified the next year in 1788 and came into effect the next year in 1789. It has served us well for what? 235 years. It's managed to enable us to maintain that rarest of rare things in history, a republican democracy. We all enjoy the blessings of the work of our founders, so I think it is fitting that we celebrate Constitution Day. Those of us who are citizens of republican democracies tend not to refer to those who govern us as our rulers, now do we? Our boast is that we rule ourselves. And there's truth in this, inasmuch as we participate in choosing those who do rule. So we prefer to speak of governors and senators and presidents and so forth, other officials, not as our rulers, but as servants, public servants, or at least people in public service. Now, of course, these so-called servants are nothing remotely like the servants on Downton Abbey. The extraordinary prestige and usually the trappings of public office in just about all times and at all places would by themselves be sufficient to distinguish, say, the mayor of Pittsburgh or Governor Shapiro or the President of the United States from Carson the butler. But that prestige signals an underlying fact that discomfits our democratic and egalitarian sensibilities, namely, the fact that even in liberal democratic regimes like ours, high public officials are rulers. They make the rules, they enforce the rules, and they resolve disputes about the meaning and applicability of the rules. To a very large extent, what they say goes. But of course, our rulers rule not by dint of sheer power, the way the mafia might rule in a territory over which it happens to have gained control. Rather, our rulers rule lawfully, that is, in accordance with constitutional rules. Those are rules that specify public offices and settle procedures for filling those offices. So though our public office holders are indeed rulers, they're not absolute rulers or lawless rulers. Constitutional rules set the scope and thus the limits of their jurisdiction, that is, their legal authority. So they are rulers who are themselves subject to rules. That's the whole idea of a constitution. The rulers are subject to rules. They rule in limited ways and ordinarily for limited terms, which may or may not be indefinitely renewable at the pleasure of the voters. They rule by virtue of democratic procedures, processes, by which they came to hold whatever office they hold. And they can be removed or significantly disempowered at the next election if the people are not happy with them or not happy with their party. Still, for all that, they rule. Now, my point is not to hoot at the idea of government and those holding governmental offices and controlling the levers of governmental power as servants. I'm not trying to laugh at that. On the contrary, I want in the end to defend the idea that rulers truly can be and should be, in a sense, servants. I want to establish, however, that if these people are indeed servants, these people we call public servants, if they're indeed servants, then they are servants in a very special sense, a sense that's compatible with them at the same time being rulers. They are people who serve us by ruling. They serve us well by ruling well. If they rule us badly, they serve us poorly, they disserve us. Now, there are, of course, lots of ways that rulers can serve poorly, those whom they have an obligation to serve by ruling well. Most obviously, there is incompetence. Then, of course, there is corruption. And at the extreme, there is the thing we fear most, the thing we hope our Constitution will protect us from, tyranny. So what does it mean for the ruler to be a servant? What does it mean for someone holding political office and exercising public power to rule well? Well, it means taking and executing decisions for the sake of the common good, a concept which itself requires an understanding of the human good, what is good for human beings, flesh and blood creatures like you and me. Those goods of human nature which, as aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of people, human beings, ourselves, are constitutive of our flourishing. Such decisions will, as Dr. Martin Luther King observed, necessarily be compatible with the requirements of natural law, natural justice, and at the same time they will embody justice. They will be just decisions. If we understand the concept of the common good properly, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go along, then we will see that no decision that violates a requirement of justice can truly be for the common good. And no decision that genuinely upholds and serves the common good will fail to advance the cause of justice. Now, of course, reasonable people of goodwill can and do, often do, certainly do today, disagree about what the common good requires and forbids and what is in truth just and unjust. Even the finest minds, the purest people, have disagreed on some points of what justice requires. And honorable people exercising public power can commit what are in truth injustices, even grave injustices, while seeking in good faith to do justice and believing in good faith that they are doing it. That is simply to affirm what Christians mean by sin. Original sin. We are frail, we are fallen, we are fallible. All of us can make mistakes, even when doing our best to get it right. Even on great questions of morality and justice, we can be in error, and therefore it's always necessary for us to bear in mind our own fallibility, to be open to criticism, to challenge, to critique, to rethinking. And it's terribly important, given that all of us are frail and fallen and fallible human beings, that our rulers are themselves subjected to rules, that nobody has unlimited and unchecked power. That's the whole theory of our Constitution, to pit power against power, to check power, to divide power, so no one can, with impunity, simply work his will. So just as not all violations of the common good are injustices, not all injustices are the result of malice or ill will or like vices. Still, all injustices, even if committed by officials who are sincerely trying to do the right thing, harm the common good. For justice is itself a common good and a central aspect of the common good of the political community. It's to the benefit of each and every citizen, each and every member of the community, to live in a just social order. And harm to that order is therefore a loss for everyone, and not merely for the immediate and obvious victims of any particular injustice. Indeed, it is a loss even for the ostensible beneficiaries of injustices, and indeed even for the perpetrators of injustice. They too lose out on the good of living in a justly ordered community, though naturally true evildoers don't see it that way. Corruption of character narrows their vision, blinding them to the profound respects in which wrongdoing harms what is in truth their interest in living in a just society, as well as everybody else's interest. The common good requires that there be rulers and that they actually rule. It would not be for the common good to have anarchy. So having rulers is not bad. It is necessary. It is good, just as checking the power of the rulers, limiting the power of the rulers is good. To grasp this is to begin to see the sense in which good rulers are indeed also servants. Members of society face a range, sometimes a vast range, of challenges and opportunities, requiring various forms of coordination, including in the case of complex societies, coordination problems that arise by virtue of the large number and the complexity of other coordination problems. We have to organize ourselves to get things done. Since such problems cannot, as a practical matter, be resolved by unanimity, authority is required, political authority. Institutions have to be created and maintained, and persons will need to be installed in the offices of these institutions to make the choices and decisions that must be made and to do the things that need to be done for the sake of protecting public health, safety, and morals, upholding the rights and dignity of individuals and families and non-governmental entities of various descriptions, and advancing the overall common good. We need people to have power to make decisions, but at the same time, we need to deal with the dangers of putting too much power or unchecked power in the hands of anyone. And this would be true even in a society of perfect saints, where no one ever sought more than his fair share from the stock, the common stock, or violated the rights of others, or deliberately acted in any manner that was contrary to the common good. This explains why, contrary to what one of my great heroes, James Madison, says in the Federalist Papers, government would in fact be necessary even if men were angels. Madison said government wouldn't be necessary if men were angels. Actually, it would be necessary. It's not sin or sin alone that accounts for why effective coordination for the sake of common goals, and thus for the common good, is required. So it's not sin or sin alone that demands that authority be established and that persons filling offices established by law exercise authority. That is, rulers ruling. Just a simple example illustrated, and we could have hundreds and thousands of such examples. We need somebody to decide, are we going to drive on the left or on the right? They do it in England one way, we do it in America and in most of continental Europe another way. Now, that's not a big moral decision. It's not unjust to drive on the left or unjust to drive on the right. But we've got to drive either on the left or the right. If we say, we're going to leave it up to individual drivers, what are we going to have? Crashes, people running over pedestrians, traffic jams. It'll be chaos, even in a society of perfect saints. So we need people to make decisions on behalf of the community, and that is to say, to exercise authority, power, for the sake of the common good. And we need that not simply in virtue of sin. But the moral justification for the ruler's ruling is service to the good of all, the common good. And the common good is not some abstraction or platonic form hovering somewhere out there beyond the concrete well-being, the flourishing of the flesh and blood persons constituting the community. No, it just is the well-being of the flesh and blood persons constituting the community, and of the families and other associations of persons, what Edmund Burke called the little platoons of civil society, of which all of us are members. The right of legitimate rulers to rule is rooted in the duty of those rulers to rule in the interests of all. In other words, the basis of the right to rule is the duty to serve. And the realities that constitute the content of that service are the various elements of the common good. By doing what is for the common good and avoiding doing what harms or undermines the common good, rulers fulfill their obligations to the people over whom they exercise authority, thus serving their interests, their welfare, their flourishing. In a word, serving them. But how is the common good of the political community, the common good served by good rulers, to be understood? Well, the common good is best conceived, in my opinion, as a set of conditions that we should work, rulers should work, citizens should work to fulfill. And those are conditions for enabling members of our community and any community to attain for themselves, by their efforts, reasonable objectives, to realize reasonably for themselves the values for the sake of which they have reason to collaborate with each other in a community, whether it's building a library for the town, fixing the streets, the roads, building a recreational center, a pool maybe, something like that, a gymnasium for the kids, a playground, preserving the environment, getting things done that we can't do as individuals and can't do as families, but we can do as a broader community. The common good is, in this sense, facilitative. It facilitates us in achieving goals that are desirable and reasonable, that enable us to flourish in respect of our physical health, our intellectual well-being, our moral well-being, and so forth. The elements of the common good are what enable people to do things individually and in cooperation with others, the doing of which constitutes their integral flourishing, their all-round flourishing. Under favoring conditions, people can more fully and more successfully carry out their reasonable projects, pursue reasonable objectives, and thus participate in values, including some values that are inherently social, in that they fulfill persons in respect of their capacities for non-instrumental forms of interpersonal communion, like friendship, like marriage, and so forth, that are indeed constitutive of the well-being and fulfillment of all of us as human beings. Properly understood, then, the common good requires, as a matter of natural law, natural justice, limited government, checks on power, checks and limits on governmental power. We can't do away with government. We can't have anarchy. That's not for the common good. But government mustn't be overbearing. It mustn't take away from us the opportunities and the rights to do things for ourselves that we can do for ourselves, thereby participating in our own fulfillment. We need government that respects the right of people to pursue objectives and realize goods for themselves. So the fundamental role of legitimate government, and thus the responsibility of legitimate rulers, rulers who serve, is not to be doing things for people that they could best do for themselves. It's rather to be helping to establish and maintain, again, conditions that favor and facilitate people's doing things that will enhance their overall well-being, their flourishing. Government should do things for people as opposed to letting people do things for themselves or assisting people in doing things for themselves, only where individuals and non-governmental institutions of civil society, families, churches, and so forth, cannot do them, or cannot do them reasonably, or be expected to do them for themselves. We can't rely on civil society to provide for the national defense. That's just a crystal clear case of an instance where all the institutions of civil society and all the individuals need to rely on political authority to protect an important aspect of our good. Now, I want to emphasize that this facilitative conception of the common good, with its emphasis on limited government power, does not require, as some I think imagine, but I don't think it requires, any kind of doctrinaire libertarianism, either in the domain of political economy or social morality. But it clearly does, in my opinion, exclude corporatist and socialist policies that withdraw from individuals and families and commit to larger governmental institutions, those things that individuals and families and churches and civic associations can do and do well for themselves, what they can accomplish. Surely such a conception of the common good that is serious about what we sometimes call the principle of subsidiarity, that is, letting people do for themselves what they can accomplish for themselves and only shifting power upwards from individuals and families and civil society to government at various levels, when it's the only way of getting the job done. Social, that is, comprehensive or even widespread ownership of the means of production, the idea championed in the 19th century by Karl Marx and then, of course, put into practice by governments in the old Soviet Union, of course today in China, Vietnam, and elsewhere, communist governments, anything resembling a command economy would obviously undermine the principle of subsidiarity and the aspects of the common good that it protects. And this would be true even if the record of communist and other socialist states were benign when it came to respect for civil liberties, which it is not, and never has been. But it still, even if it did, would be robbing people of opportunities that are essential for them to take advantage of as aspects of their own flourishing. And again, it would be true even if, again, contrary to the historical record, private property and some sort of functioning market system were not necessary as checks against the excessive concentration and inevitably abuse of power in the hands of public officials. But as I've noted, the historical record demonstrates that private property in the market system, while not sufficient as guarantees against the concentration and abuse of political power, not sufficient, are for all intents and purposes necessary conditions for civil liberty and limited government. And there's a profound lesson in this, it seems to me, for those of us who are interested in ensuring that rulers remain servants, ruling in the interests of citizens, and don't reduce the citizenry to the status of serfs or dependents. For it's critical to the effective limitation of governmental power that there be substantial non-governmental centers of power in society. If my dear friend and teaching partner and debating partner Cornel West were here, he would, though, remind us, and he would be right to remind us, that there is also a danger from the concentration of power in private hands, from monopoly and oligopoly. And that's true. But that danger, it seems to me, does not justify our ignoring the danger of concentrations of power in the hands of public officials. Now, all of this goes well beyond economics. If we understand the common good, if we have a grasp of what constitutes or is conducive to the flourishing of human beings and what's not, we will recognize that limited government is also important because it permits the functioning and flourishing of those non-governmental institutions of civil society, those little platoons, again, to use Burke's language, the families and the churches, the civic associations, Little League, Campfire Girls, 4-H, all of these institutions that do so much good for us, but can only do that good because they are not under the command and direction and control of the government. And again, these are institutions, beginning with the family and with the church, that perform better than government at any level ever could the most essential, the most basic health, education, and welfare functions, and which play the primary role, and must play the primary role because government can't do it, of transmitting to each new generation the virtues without which free societies cannot survive. Basic honesty, for example, integrity, self-restraint, concern for others and respect for their dignity and rights, civic-mindedness, and the like. Our Republican democracy and all good government depends on there being plenty of citizens who embody those virtues. There will always be some who don't. But for the system to work, most people have to have substantial virtues of that sort. But for those who have them, where did they get them? Did President Biden issue a command that made us all virtuous? Did Chief Justice Roberts issue a court order to make us all virtuous? Was it the Senate? Was it the House? No. You're virtuous people. How did that happen? Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, pastor, coach, teacher. People who know you as an individual in a way that President Biden can't, Chief Justice Roberts can't, Speaker of the House Johnson can't. That's how virtue is transmitted. And if we undermine the institutions that we rely on to transmit virtue, then the cause of Republican democracy will sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, be lost. It's these non-governmental authority structures that represent another crucial way in which power is properly diffused and not concentrated in the hands of the state or its officials. They can play their role, these non-governmental institutions, only when government is limited. For unlimited government, look at China, best example today. Unlimited government always usurps the authority of those little platoons, of those institutions of civil society, destroys their autonomy, usually recruiting or commandeering them into being state functionary organs. And where they're playing their proper role, these institutions help to create conditions in which the ideal of limited government is much more likely to be realized and preserved, and its benefits enjoyed by the people. So a critical element of any discussion of the quality of democratic deliberation and decision-making that amounts to anything more than hot air will be the indispensable role of non-governmental institutions, beginning with the family and the church and the civic association and so forth, in sustaining a culture, a civic culture, in which political institutions do what they're supposed to do it pretty well, never perfectly, of course, we're human, they're human, and don't do what they're not authorized to do. Don't step outside their lane, don't step over the line, don't become dictatorial. And so we must be mindful that bad behavior on the part of political institutions, which means bad behavior on the part of the people who exercise power as holders of public office, can weaken, enervate, and even corrupt these institutions of civil society. Again, look at China. China's got its own official patriotic churches meant to displace the actual Christian churches. It's easy to see what's going on there. They've commandeered these institutions, put them under state power, made them functionaries and organs of the state, rendering these institutions absolutely impotent to resist the bad behavior of officials and useless to the cause of political reform. The so-called patriotic churches in China are of no use to political reform, let me assure you. The pressure for reform comes from the renegades, those churches that refuse to buckle under to the state. Now, none of this is to deny the importance of constitutional structures and constraints on power. They are very important indeed. The American constitutional system is on solid ground in establishing and insisting upon what in high school you were probably taught to call the checks and balances. Do they still use that language? Is that the checks and balances? Those are checks on power. That's balancing executive power against legislative power and judicial power. Those are good. Those are important. I would say they're indispensable. I don't think Republican government could have survived without them for these 235 years. But experience shows all too well that those structural constraints will be effective only where they are effectually supported by the people, that is to say, by the political culture. The people need to understand their constitutional structures and principles. And they need to value them and believe in them enough to resist the usurpations by their rulers, even when unconstitutional programs offer immediate gratifications or the relief of urgent problems. So what the founders knew we had to fear was an urgent problem arises, an economic catastrophe, a danger from a foreign power. People get scared. Things get bad. So who pops up? The strong man who says, you know, if you let me have power and you do away with these formalities, these constraints on my power, these checks and balances, I'll fix your problem. I'll get us out of this depression. I'll protect us from this terrorist threat. And that's how freedom, Republican freedom, is lost. The founders knew this. They worried about the demagogue. And the system of structural constraints they put into place was meant to protect against the rise of the demagogue. But my point to you today is those constraints, while necessary, are not sufficient. There needs to be a political culture that supports them. People need to believe in the system and understand the system well enough to resist the blandishments in difficult circumstances that you will experience when things are bad and somebody says, all you need to do is give me a bit more power, in other words, give up a bit more of your liberty, to fix the problem. But these virtues do not simply fall down on people from the heavens. They have to be transmitted through the generations and nurtured by each generation, mine and yours. Madison said, and on this one he was 100% right, that only a well-instructed people can be permanently a free people. That's absolutely true. It points to the fact that even the best constitutional structures, even the strongest structural constraints on governmental power, aren't worth the paper they are printed on. They're mere parchment guarantees, unless the people understand them, value them, and indeed have the will, possess the character to resist the blandishments of those who come along offering something tempting, relief from this problem, advancement, in return for giving them up or letting violations of them occur without swift and certain political retaliation at the ballot box. But it's also true that virtue is needed. And that's not merely a matter of improving civics teaching in homes and schools and universities. The Constitution of the United States was famously defended by Madison in Federalist Paper number 51 as, and I quote, supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. That is, pitting power against power to supply what is needed, given that we can't always rely on virtue. And he made this point immediately after observing that the first task of government is to control the governed, and the second is to control itself. He allowed that, and again I quote, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions, unquote. Those auxiliary precautions are the constitutional structural constraints, those principles of checks and balances. But even in this formulation, notice this, those structural constraints, those checks and balances, do not stand alone. Indeed, they are presented as secondary. That's what auxiliary means, not primary. What's primary? A healthy and vibrant political culture, a dependence on the people and their virtues to keep the rulers in line. It takes both, the structural constraints and the civic virtues. And that brings us to the role of importance of virtue. Now, John Adams, the second president of the United States, understood as well as anyone the general theory of the Constitution. He was, and here I always get myself into trouble because all my colleagues in political science and political philosophy disagree with me, but I'm going to say it anyway. He was the ablest scholar and political theorist of the founding generation. Prove me wrong, guys. Jefferson sometimes gets the credit. Everybody's so impressed with Jefferson and how profound and brilliant he was. But I think if you actually look at the record, Jefferson was a brilliant man. I think if you look at the record, the deep thought about political theory, the deeper thought, I think you find in the work of Adams. In any case, whether I'm right or wrong about that, Adams certainly got the point about supplying the defect of better motives, that you need the structural constraints, the checks and balances. Yet Adams also understood, and I think it's really critical that we understand, and that our children and someday our children's children understand, that the health of a political culture is an indispensable element of the success of the constitutional enterprise, an enterprise of ensuring that the rulers stay within the bounds of their legitimate authority and be servants of the common good, servants of the people they rule. Adams remarked famously that our Constitution, I'm quoting, is made for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. unquote. That shocks people today, some people. Shouldn't. It was what was believed by the entire founding generation, even the allegedly atheistic, he actually wasn't an atheist, but the certainly more secular Thomas Jefferson, that our Constitution isn't made for just any kind of people. It's not a system that will operate irrespective of the civic culture, irrespective of the virtues of the people, irrespective of the people's deep beliefs about issues of meaning and value, justice and injustice, right and wrong. Adams articulated what all of our founders understood to be essential. Our Constitution is made for a people that has the virtues and understandings that enable this constitutional system to work. Now, why? Well, it's because people lacking in virtue, a people lacking in virtue, can be counted on eventually, sooner or later, to trade their liberty for protection, for financial or personal security, for comfort, for being looked after, for being taken care of, for having their problems solved quickly. And there will always be people, some occupying or standing for public office, who will be happy to offer them the deal, an expansion of their power in return for what they can offer by virtue of that expansion. So the question then is how to form people, citizens, men and women, fitted out with the virtues, making them worthy and capable of freedom, capable of preserving constitutionally limited government, even in the face of strong temptations, which will inevitably come: depressions, pandemics, wars, creating temptations to compromise away those constraints on power, to compromise away their own liberties. Now, here we see the central political role and significance of those basic institutions of civil society, those little platoons again, the family, the religious community, the other private associations that are devoted to the inculcation of knowledge and virtue. And private, very often in our country, religiously based educational institutions like this one that are in the business of transmitting not only knowledge, but, I think I'm telling the truth here, Madam Provost, virtue. Geneva cares deeply that you learn a lot, that you know a lot, but it also rightly cares about your character, about what kind of person you are. And that's important as a contribution to the overall good, to forming citizens who can maintain and flourish in circumstances of Republican liberty. These virtue-transmitting institutions are, as is often said, mediating institutions that provide a buffer between the individual and the power of the central state. It is ultimately the autonomy, integrity, and general flourishing of these institutions that will determine the fate of limited constitutional government, here and anywhere else where it is tried. And this is not only because of their primary and indispensable role in transmitting virtue, though that's true. It's also because their performance of health, education, and welfare functions is the only real alternative to the removal of those functions to larger and higher associations or social units, ultimately to government. And when government expands to play the primary role in performing these functions, the ideal of limited government is inevitably lost. It's soon lost. No matter how good, no matter how strong the formal structural constraints of the Constitution are. Those formal structural constraints can become mere parchment guarantees of no real significance very quickly when the people have lost their virtue. And the corresponding weakening of the status and authority of the institutions of civil society, especially the family, damages their ability to perform those health, education, and welfare functions and their essential pedagogical moral functions. With that, these institutions surely lose their capacity to influence for good the political culture, which at the end of the day is the whole shooting match when it comes to whether the ruler can truly be a servant. Thank you for the opportunity to give your Constitution Day address. It's a great honor for me. Thank you. I'd be very happy to take questions and comments.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
God forbid a tyrannical ruler takes power. Do you think the check of authority comes from the people or the lesser magistrate? And if a tyrannical authority takes power, do you think the intermediary institutions would protect us?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent one. I think the intermediary institutions, if tyrannical forces take power, are our only hope. If we look around the globe and we look across history at where we've had successful resistance, that successful resistance to tyranny has always originated in the institutions of civil society. Now, most of you were born when? 2000, between 2000 and 2005, have I got it about right? Yeah, that's right. So for you, the collapse of Soviet communism in Europe, or communism in Europe and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations was history, right? It was history for you. But for those of us who lived through it, we remember very well, how did it all begin? Madam Provost, where did it all begin? In Poland. In Poland. Why did it begin in Poland? Anybody know? I'm sorry? Solidarity. Okay? Now, what did Solidarity, which was a workers' union led by Lech Walesa, what made it possible for them, despite the constraints that they were under, living under a dictatorial regime, to organize successfully and bring pressure to bear? It's the Catholic Church. Unlike what happened in so many other Soviet countries, Poland allowed religion to continue to have autonomy and independence. And it was that religious basis, it was in the church that the Solidarity movement was nurtured. The church, even through the communist period, represented an alternative authority structure. And that's what began the undoing of the whole thing. It was the then very recently elected Pope John Paul II's visit back to Poland, where he had been born and had been a bishop, early in his pontificate, that supercharged Solidarity and gave rise to the movement, which in, I think, a little less than a decade is what it took in the end, brought down the puppet regime in Poland and began the falling of the dominoes, which ended up toppling even the Soviet Union. And that's just a typical common, and it's why, by the way, tyrannical regimes always do try to crush. This is the real answer to your question back there. It's why tyrannical regimes always try to crush institutions of civil society. It's why China does it today. When I was chairing the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we did a lot of work having to do with China, because China's a terrible, oppressive regime, especially of religious people of all faiths, whether you're talking about Tibetan Buddhists, house church evangelicals, the Catholic Church. They were an equal opportunity oppressor. But one of the things that I was puzzled by was why the communist regime in China so brutally repressed and persecuted the Falun Gong. Have any of you ever heard of the Falun Gong? The Falun Gong, sometimes depicted in the West as another religion. It's not a religion. Nothing we would recognize as a religion. It's a civil society organization but it's involved in things more like phys ed, physical health, kind of training people to be healthier mentally and healthier physically. They don't have a theological doctrine, and they don't have a political doctrine. But they're being brutally repressed by the Chinese communists. Now, I'm saying to myself as I'm chairing the commission, I understand why they're persecuting the church. I understand why they're persecuting the Tibetan Buddhists. They learned the lesson from the Soviet Union. They learned the lesson that, man, religion can be really dangerous to tyrannical regimes. You better crush it and get it under your control. But I couldn't figure out, so why persecute the Falun Gong? You're absolutely harmless people. It's because it's not religion as such that they're worried about. It's alternative authority structures existing in civil society which could play the role that the church played in the fall of European communism. That's why they were repressing even the Falun Gong. So yes, I think it's our only hope. Now, is it a guarantee? Absolutely not. There are no guarantees in this life. My young friends, there are no guarantees. All we can do is hope for the best and do our part when it comes to things like righting wrongs, correcting injustices, and in the worst situations, combating tyranny. There's no guarantee, at least until the second coming of Jesus. All we can do is our best. We'll be able to do better if the institutions of civil society can play their essential roles. And that's why they're almost like a vaccine, a protective policy against tyranny. It was a great question. Next question. Does maybe people up there have?
I'm pretty loud. I have a mic right here. Hello. I just wanted to thank you for your lecture. It was outstanding and amazing. But also, I wanted to ask you a question about the nature of executive orders. You talked a lot about the checks and balances of powers. How do executive orders distort that? It's been argued to me that they change the nature of our government from a constitutional republic into a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, by bypassing the legislator. What are your thoughts?
I didn't plant that question. You're trying to wind me up now, aren't you? You must know about me. You're trying to wind me up. Okay. I have been, for years, using my little platform in the academic world and the work I've done on the various governmental commissions and so forth to plead with people to respect the distribution and separation of powers in the constitutional system, in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. My big worry is the erosion of legislative power. That is where the people have their greatest influence. The erosion in two directions of legislative power. One direction to the judiciary, where in decision after decision after decision, the Supreme Court has usurped the authority of the people acting through their elected representatives by imposing policies on the country with no warrant in the text or logic or structure or original understanding of the Constitution. In the other direction, and this goes right to your question, it's executive power. Decisions that should be made by Congress being made by executive orders or in signing statements or in other edicts by presidents. And that does shift us in the direction of monarchical power. When you have a chance, students, I want you to look at the Constitution. Have a good look at it. And I want to call your attention to a particular word. It's the most neglected and forgotten word in the entire Constitution. And that's ironic and surprising because it's the very first word of the very first and only sentence of the very first article of the Constitution. So after we get the preamble, which tells us why we're going to do what we do, we reach Article 1 where we begin actually doing it. And the first word is, does anybody happen to know what the first word is? The first word is all, A-L-L. It is not some, it is not most, it is not a lot, it is all. And the sentence reads, all legislative authority herein granted is conferred on a Congress of the United States consisting of the House of Representatives and the Senate. In other words, it's not that Congress has some or even most legislative power, but the judiciary has some and the executive has some. No. The Congress has all. And yet, by delegation and abdication in many cases, and sometimes by usurpation from the other branches, a great deal of Congress's power has been lost. And it doesn't just go up into the air, into the ether. It goes either into the judiciary or into the executive. So we are not functioning faithfully to our constitutional system when presidents use executive orders, signing statements, and other mechanisms to, in effect, legislate without a warrant in the Constitution. Now, am I condemning executive orders as such? No. The president has to be able to run the executive branch of government, and that will require him to formulate certain rules. The problem is one of abuse. It's using the executive orders as a pretext for legislating. And I blame Congress too, because as I said a moment ago, it's not just that the president usurped their authority, they let him get away with it. And they delegate some of it to him. So much has gone over to the agencies. You know, you can see why in a democratic system this would happen. Legislators like to get elected, and one way, you know, you make yourself safe is by not voting on controversial questions, shifting those questions out of your own hands to either the judiciary or to the executive, and you just vote on the stuff that's going to be popular in your district or your state. So, you know, it doesn't require you to make politically dangerous decisions and cast politically dangerous votes. But here is an example of a lack of virtue, here not so much in the people, but in the representatives of the people. And I think we have to hold their feet to the fire and insist that they take back from both sides, from the judiciary and from the executive, the power vested in them by the Constitution in that word all.
We're about out of time. Dr. George will be available from 11:30 to 1 in the PDR. I know some of you have said you're coming. If you have more questions or want to continue this, I'd encourage you to look in, and if there's room, interact. But let's thank Dr. George again.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone.